Hello, I'm Tony Inadio, and this lecture is meant to accompany my course, American Business History. I'm going to go over a list of terms and definitions so that we understand what we're talking about. Most of these are my own wording based on my research. I'm hoping that I can make some very complex ideas simple to understand. I will also provide you with a Word document with these definitions. So I like to start my class with a question. What is the name of our economic system in the United States? And this is a very difficult question for people to answer, but the two most common answers are capitalism or a mixed economy. Well, I'll get to the answer later on in the lecture, but I want you to keep it in mind as we go through this. So part of the confusion, why this is so difficult to answer, is because we don't often define our terms. And if you have commonly accepted definitions, then everybody will at least be on the same page. So this is very difficult. It's harder than it seems. In fact, the first word that we're going to define in some ways is the most important because it's the one that people don't often understand, and that is the word definition. So what is a definition? So a definition is the identification of a concept by means of its essential characteristics. This is a problem because many people will confuse an example of a word with the definition. But a proper definition is only the essentials. It essentially omits measurements. And what I mean by that is I'll give you an example of a table. If we define a table as a freestanding object with an elevated flat level surface meant for the support of smaller objects, there are a lot of things I haven't told you in that definition. I haven't told you how high it's elevated, how big it is, how much it weighs, what color it is, how many legs it has. So you omit the measurements, the particular measurements of a good definition. And in that way, we save space in our brains. We have a concept that we can apply to all existence. So for example, when you see a table that you've never seen before, you know it's a table. We don't have to have another definition for every single table on the planet. So that's the proper function of a definition. They're made up of a couple of parts. So one is this notion of the abstract. The abstract is an idea, thought, or principle that we use to understand existence, as opposed to a concrete is that which physically exists. So I'll give you an example of these two and their relationship. Bill bought a new lawnmower and doesn't need his old lawnmower, so he wants to sell it. Dave needs a lawnmower and wants to buy one. The cost of the lawnmower is $50. Dave has $50, but he'd rather not spend all that money on the lawnmower, so maybe he offers $40. The two men come to an agreement, the sale is made, and neighborly harmony is restored. One example. Juliet wants to go to the ballet, but she doesn't want to go alone. Romeo hates the ballet, but the week after that, he wants to go to the Judas Priest concert, but Juliet can't stand heavy metal music. He doesn't want to go alone either. So Romeo makes a concession and goes to the ballet with Juliet, and Juliet attends the heavy metal concert. Now, concretely, these are totally different things, right? But there is a common abstract principle common to both of them, and that is the notion of compromise. So that's really the difference between the two, and where people often go wrong with definitions. Okay, so history, that's what we're doing here, or what we're trying to understand. History is simply everything in the past. That's a very straightforward definition. However, what we're specifically doing in our course is known as the discipline of history, which is a little bit different than just history. The discipline of history is the study of the past that answers questions. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What does this mean? Why is it important? So it's more than just the stuff that happened in the past. If it were really that simple, then pretty much anybody could do history if you're just going to report on the things that happened in the past. So what we try to do is explain it, to interpret it, to understand it. That's what the discipline of history does. And part of that discipline involves a term known as historiography. Historiography is the study of historical analysis. So historians look at the evidence of history. They try to offer an interpretation, but they don't always get it right. Sometimes they don't have enough evidence. Sometimes new evidence comes to light, or they have a particular philosophical mindset and see the past through that lens. So what historiography is we're studying historical analysis. And I'll give you a good example. In our course, we're going to look at the Gilded Age. There are these men who created these businesses that had never existed in history before. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Schwab, Hill. They're often called the robber barons. That's one way to look at them. Other historians call them captains of industry. So those are two very different terms, so it depends on how you understand the past. They're the same guys, so that's what we mean by historiography, to look at that analysis. All right, so let's look at some philosophical concepts. The first is human nature. What is human nature? It is merely the state of existence fundamental to Homo sapiens. Now, sometimes we don't understand exactly what it is. We know we're conscious, but yet we're not entirely sure what is consciousness. But whatever it is what it is, even if we don't know it. Now, this is opposed to specific behavior. For example, just because some people commit acts of evil, or even that all people are capable of evil, does not mean that all people are actually evil by nature. You know, some people commit murder. Most people go through life and never commit murder. So we have to draw the distinction between, the concrete and the abstract. All right, morality. Morality is a code of values to guide one's actions and choices and determines the purpose and course of one's life. If it is not open to your choice, then it is not an issue of morality. So it just deals with issues that are open to your choice. And it doesn't really tell you what those values are. It just simply says it's a code of values. That's it. A hierarchy is a classification based on a standard of measurement. It is a necessity for conceptual thinking, for morality, and for the study of history. Everything has a hierarchy. All right, so let's now talk about rights. What are rights? Rights are moral principles. They're moral because they are open to our choice. So for example, if we had no choice, we had no free will, then everything would be determined. So we would just do what we were programmed to do, and that's it. There could be no such thing as right or wrong. There wouldn't be any concept of rights. Nobody would ever, mess with anybody else. So they are moral principles determined by human nature that sanction the freedom of volitional individual action. And that means that rights can only be violated by the initiation of force. So for example, existence exists. So let's get into this and try to understand what is this notion of rights and life. So existence exists, right? Life itself has a fundamental alternative, life or death. It's either or, to be or not to be. For there to be life, certain conditions must be met, or life will cease. Therefore, life is the standard of value. With that and the fact that we are individual discrete entities, then, life is the fundamental right from which all other rights are derived. Okay, so let's look at a few of those. In order to live, you must move. We cannot stay in one place, right? The nature of our existence requires motion, and we engage in that motion first by choice. We engage in the motion which requires effort. In order to do that, we need liberty. So if life is a right, then liberty is a right. As we move and make effort by choice, we must also acquire property. So for example, I am breathing right now. The air in this room enters my lungs, and then my body does things to that which sustains my life. So that air in my lungs is, at this moment, my property. You cannot live without property. Same thing goes for food or anything else in our life. Food, clothing, and shelter, if we think of those things as necessity, is the application of effort or labor to some object which sustains our life. In many ways, property is the most important of them all, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, we commonly hear the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, but it's a little more complex than just thinking we should be happy. What the pursuit of happiness really means is that each of us as individual discrete entities with these rights can pursue the things in life that are right to us. So I became a history professor. Other people become lawyers or doctors or welders or what have you. Each of us pursues those things which provide us with happiness. And it also says to us that we must pursue our happiness, right? These are not guarantees. Rights are not given to us by someone or guaranteed to us by someone or something. They're simply part of our nature. John Locke called them natural rights. So they're not even obligations on others. The pursuit of happiness doesn't mean somebody has to provide you with happiness. There is an exception here, though, and that applies to children. Children, by their nature, cannot take care of themselves, so there is an obligation on their parent or legal guardian to provide for their life. But at certain ages, those obligations end. So as individual entities, the only rights that are even possible are individual rights. They're the only ones that are proper. Okay, so I mentioned force, that rights can only be violated by the initiation of force. So what is force? Force is any action that physically compels a person against their will. Force is exercised in two ways. There is the initiation of force, which is always wrong. And it is that fact which makes the retaliatory use of force proper. All people have the right of self-defense. In a proper society, however, we delegate much of that to the government, except in emergency situations where the government can't be there immediately. So if your life was in danger, then you have the right of self-defense. But generally, if somebody breaks a contract with you, then you ask the government to fix it rather than beating them up. And so what is government? Government is simply an institution that determines and enforces law. A proper government has really only one function, and that is to protect individual rights. That's it. Which it does through the police, the military, and the court system, because those are the only ways in which force can be initiated against you, is by a person, another nation, or in a contractual agreement. All right, so I mentioned property. Property is an object or an idea produced or resourced by humans, by human effort, with control retained. And that last part is really important, because if you don't have control, then you don't own the property. So it is essential to property that it must be controlled by the person. Technology is the application of an idea to the cause of human existence. So even very simple things like understanding how to farm, putting, scratching dirt, putting a seed, watering it, that's a form of technology. You're sort of transforming something as an idea for your own human existence. A resource is raw material that is used or transformed for a technological purpose. We live on a giant ball of resources that we use and transform to make our lives better. Goods are materials produced or resourced by humans for use or sale. So as I said, some of these are pretty straightforward. They don't require a lot of explanation. Services is simply labor offered for use or sale. Wages, the price paid for labor. Labor is the effort required for the production of goods and services. Wealth, this is an interesting one. Wealth is simply property. All wealth is created or resourced. So we have to think of wealth. When we think of somebody is worth $100 billion, it's not that they have $100 billion of cash in the bank. That isn't what I mean. Is that their assets are worth that money. That's what we mean by wealth. Trade is an exchange of goods and or services by mutual consent. And again, the end of that is the most important. If you don't have mutual consent, then it's not trade, it's force. So trade requires mutual consent. Money. Money is a tool of exchange and saving. It is not always the same thing as wealth. So it's simply a device that we use as a means to even things out. And one of the ways that we do that is with the concept of bullion. Bullion is a refined quantity of precious metal. Ideally, it should be rare, durable, homogeneous, divisible, portable, and have intrinsic value. So for example, if we use sand or dirt as money, well, there'd be an awful lot of that and none of us would really have any value because we could always get it. We wouldn't need it from somebody else. And it really doesn't have a lot of intrinsic value unless you're a farmer, but it's all over the place so you can just use it. So bullion is superior to barter because it has a relatively fixed value. Even though it can fluctuate, there's some intrinsic value to it which at some point is fixed. And it's also commonly accepted and it's not perishable. So for example, if we're going to trade, you're going to dig a ditch for me and I'm going to give you a bunch of apples and you don't get around to it until 4 weeks from now and then the apples could go bad or things like that. So you have to have something that is not perishable, something that kind of evens out the trade. And money is just an efficient way to do that. Okay. Altruism. Altruism is a concept not many people really understand. It is service and self-sacrifice to others is the purpose of your life, that others are always more important than you. And that's not the way it's often defined, but that in fact is the way it is. Egoism is rational self-interest. That's all it says. Benevolence is an uncoerced act of doing good for others. So here's where it gets a little complicated because most people associate altruism with benevolence. After all, when you do something for others, it's good for them. And it can be, but that can also be in your rational self-interest, right? Rational self-interest doesn't mean you're just going to do whatever you want and trample over other people and treat them badly. I mean, that's not in your rational self-interest. You want the people that you love to be happy and you want society to function as well as it can possibly function. That's what's in your rational interest. Whereas altruism sort of forces you to say, you have more than you need, you must give that to others. And even if it's a self-sacrifice to you, maybe you don't have more than you need, maybe it's bare sustenance or something like that. So we can't confuse those two things. All right, now let's move to the economic isms. These are a bit different. These definitions are a bit different than what you might be used to, especially the first one. but bear with me and I will explain after I have gone through them all. So the first one is socialism. Socialism is a politico-economic system by which property can be redistributed without individual consent. That's all it is. Remember, we have to omit the measurements. So that's all it says. Mercantilism is an early politico-economic system where concern centers on a nationalistic prosperity with wealth measured in bullion and a property protectionist government favoring exports over imports. So those governments tended to have a lot of tariffs and things like that. Fascism is a politico-economic system where property titles are held by individuals but are completely subject to government control. So what this means is, if you use an example of a car, if you own the car, you have the title to the car. But the government will tell you when you can drive it, where you can drive it, how fast you can drive it, etc. And if the government has the power to do that, then you don't really own the car, even though the property title is yours. You don't really own it because ownership implies control. Property is control retained. So that's really all fascism is. It's private title with government control. Nazism, also known as National Socialism, is a political, social, economic system of extreme German nationalism where some property titles are held by individuals but are completely subject to government control, just like fascism. Communism is a politico-economic system by which all property is communally owned, equally distributed, and in which social classes do not exist. Okay. All of these isms are really just variations of socialism. They are more similar than different. The one ism that is truly the opposite is capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system derived from individual rights where all property is privately owned and all trade is voluntary. That is all it is. Remember, measurements and examples cannot be part of a definition. So we have to understand that, we have to look at the very principles of each of these isms. The reason why traditional definitions are not sufficient is because they're not rooted in the one fundamental concept that is essential to all of these isms, and that is the concept of property, one of the fundamental rights of human beings. Without property rights, no other rights are even possible. Control property and you control life. That is why it is necessary to control your own property, and that is why all totalitarians initiate force against property. So whether or not you agree with the nomenclature here, we do need concepts to account for these different conditions of existence regarding property. I think the terms that we have are fine, so I use them. So I come back to the first question. What is the economic system of the United States? So it's definitely not capitalism, because we do not have a system where all property is privately owned and all trade is voluntary. We don't have that. It has never existed in history. Really what we have is socialism. Socialism basically is your property can be taken from you and redistributed without your consent. Now, again, without measurements, it doesn't tell you if it will or how much of it will or when it will or anything like that. It's just it can be. That's it. Now, to be fair, many economists, if any of them are even watching this, would be freaking out right now. They would say, no, that's not true. So the definition of socialism is the government ownership of the means of production, and we don't have that, therefore we do not have socialism. So my argument, again, is that that's not a good definition of socialism. It's an example of socialism, but we can't define something by an example. The root is property. So I will offer this argument in rebuttal, and it goes to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says, Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Okay? So the government basically owns the means of production of money, and therefore that would be consistent with owning the means of production, and that is socialism. So what's interesting about this is that money is the one commodity that underlies all the other commodities. So that's why this is, in fact, socialism. Many people will still disagree with me about this, but I'm sorry, we have to consider property and this notion of that the government owns the means of production. I don't know how you get around that. Okay, so we have socialism, but we also have considerable freedom. So I would argue that America is mostly capitalistic. So we can apply it as an adjective, certainly not the noun of capitalism. We definitely don't have capitalism. But it's capitalistic. You mostly own your stuff. They just take some of it and redistribute it. All right, so a few more terms before we close out with some comments. Zero sum, we hear this a lot, is gain by one side equals loss by the other side. And at any given time, wealth is finite. But unless you have a stagnant mentality, you have to remember, wealth can be continuously created. So if there's only one pie here and only so many people can have it, we can always bake another pie, right? So at any given time, that wealth is going to increase, and all you have to do is look at the economy of the world. There is far more wealth in the world today than there was yesterday, or even going further back into the past. All wealth is created. Appropriation is to take something for one's own use without the owner's consent. That is to appropriate something. Now, slavery. Slavery is the initiation of forced labor, or the appropriation of labor by one person on another person. And when we say the word slavery, most people think of the 19th century American version of racial slavery. And most people, of course, like to think that they oppose slavery. The reality, though, is that they actually do not oppose slavery if that definition is valid. So we have to separate two things here. There is that which is legal and that which is right. So if it's in the Constitution, people will say, therefore, you have given consent, which is true from a legal standpoint, but it isn't always true from a moral standpoint. Remember, at one point, slavery was legal. That didn't make it right. And in some sense, it is still legal. So think about taxation. Taxation is simply an appropriation of labor. Now, if you want to argue against that, to say, no, taxation cannot be slavery, then you would have to prove that we are, by our nature as human beings, entitled to the labor, property, and wealth of other people. And that is exactly the mindset that has justified slavery throughout history. Good luck, because it cannot be proven. So that makes people very uncomfortable. I know that. But let me make a very radical statement about taxes. I'll make this statement, and you won't believe it, but it is actually true, that in America, there is not a single business, not one, that pays any tax whatsoever. Now, I'm going to tell you this is true, and you're going to say, no, businesses pay taxes all the time. And I will tell you that you probably don't own your own business. Because if you have a widget that costs you, say, $2 to make, and let's say you want to make $8 profit on that widget. I'm just using arbitrary numbers here. You want to make $8 profit on your widget because you want to keep expanding your business. You want to increase your profits to, hire more people and develop new widgets. So you've decided $8 profit. So that's $10. Now, if you sell that for $10, you're not going to be making $8 on your widget. If you want to make $8 on a widget that costs you $2 to make, given that taxation is roughly a third of what we make, then you must sell that widget for $15, because then a third of that, $5, goes to the government. Now you're left with $10. Your $2 cost your $8 profit. So that's why businesses don't pay taxes. You pay them. No business pays taxes. You pay them every time you buy something, and every business calculates the cost of taxes into the stuff they sell. There's just no other way to do this. You will not stay in business long if you do not calculate all of your expenses into the cost of your items. It just doesn't work. So when people say they want higher taxes, they are basically saying they want to pay more for the things that they buy. Because when you raise taxes, businesses will either raise their prices, they will cut hours or not hire people, or they cut money to shareholders. None of those are good. So it sounds radical, but it's really not. Now, given all of the definitions I've given you today, I teach this course from a pro-capitalism standpoint. I don't have any hidden agenda. I'm telling you this up front. However, the most important thing I can tell you is that as a student in this course, you are not required to agree with me at all. I've had many students take this course who completely disagreed with me. Totally fine. This isn't an ideological test. If you write well, you do good work, you back up your arguments with reason and logic, I am totally fine with that. And I'm very, very strict about being fair. Many students have disagreed with me and gotten A's in this class. So those are the definitions that I offer. If you would like to discuss any of them in more detail with me, I am really looking forward to those conversations. And if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. Thanks for listening.